You're standing in your dorm kitchen. You have ingredients. You have a pan. You even have a recipe open on your phone. But there's one problem. This stove only has 2 burners, and one of them doesn't work. There's barely enough counter space to set down a cutting board. And the only working burner is being used by someone else. That's the moment many people realize something important about cooking on their own. The recipe didn't change. The kitchen did. And that shift is where cooking for yourself starts to feel different. Not because you suddenly forgot how to cook, because the environment around the cooking has completely changed. Most people grow up seeing meals appear in a kitchen that has been slowly optimized over time. The tools are there. The drawers make sense. The counters give you space to spread out. You may have cooked before. You may have helped prepare meals. You might even be comfortable following a recipe. But when you move out, you don't inherit the system that made those meals possible. You inherit a completely new environment. And the first adjustment most people notice is space. The kitchen might be smaller than the one you grew up with, maybe much smaller. Instead of long counters and multiple burners, you might be working with a hot plate and just enough room for a spatula to rest. Suddenly, cooking becomes less about following a recipe and more about managing the space you have. You learn to cook in stages. Prep first. Cook second. Clean as you go. Not because someone taught you a special technique, but because if you don't, you simply run out of room. Then there's the equipment shift. At home, it's easy to forget how many tools quietly support everyday cooking. Multiple pans, different sized pots, mixing bowls, measuring cups, strainers, cutting boards, all the small things that make cooking feel smooth. When you move out, that entire setup resets. You might start with 1 pan, 1 pot, 1 knife, and a handful of basic utensils. And suddenly certain recipes that felt normal at home feel unrealistic, not because they're difficult, but because they assume a kitchen setup you no longer have. So you start adapting. Meals become simpler. 1-pan dinners suddenly make a lot more sense. Recipes with fewer ingredients become easier to manage. Not because your standards changed, because the environment did. There's another adjustment that catches people off guard the first time they cook outside their childhood home. The kitchen might not actually be yours. In many dorms or shared apartments, it's a common space, which means you're cooking in a room that other people are also trying to use. You might walk in planning to cook dinner and find every burner already occupied. Someone is making pasta. Someone else is reheating leftovers. And someone is standing there reading a recipe on their phone just like you. At home, the kitchen usually works around the family. When you cook on your own for the first time, the kitchen becomes a shared environment. You start learning small, unspoken rules, how long it's reasonable to use a burner, where people expect dishes to go, what happens when someone else needs the space you're using. It's not complicated, but it is new. And those small social adjustments are part of what makes cooking outside your childhood home feel different at first. Once you start adapting to the space and the tools, something else begins to shift. Cooking becomes less about perfect recipes and more about building routines. At home, meals often appear as part of a larger family rhythm. Someone plans the grocery list. Someone notices when ingredients run out. Someone remembers which nights need quick meals. When you're cooking for yourself, those systems become your responsibility. Cooking connects to grocery shopping, which connects to planning meals, which connects to leftovers, which connects to how much space you actually have in your fridge. It's not just a recipe anymore, it's a system. Another thing people don't always anticipate is how closely cooking connects to grocery shopping. At home, those two things are often invisible to each other. Food appears in the refrigerator. Ingredients are already there when someone starts cooking. But when you're responsible for both sides of the system, the connection becomes obvious. If you want to cook something, the ingredients have to exist, which means you bought them, which means you planned for them, which means you remembered them while standing in the grocery store. This is where cooking starts to feel less like following recipes and more like managing a small ecosystem. You begin noticing patterns. Which ingredients last longer? Which meals create leftovers? Which foods are actually worth keeping on hand all the time? And gradually cooking stops being something you do occasionally. It becomes something you design around. You start noticing things you didn't think about before. How quickly dishes pile up if you don't clean them. How helpful it is to have a few simple meals you can make without thinking too hard. These are small realizations, but they add up. Over time, cooking stops feeling like a special activity. It becomes part of the rhythm of your week. Not every meal needs to be impressive. Not every recipe needs to be ambitious. Sometimes the goal is simply making something that works in the space you have with the tools available to you. And that realization is where cooking starts to feel easier. Because once you accept the limits of the environment, you start building systems that fit it. The kitchen may be smaller, but your confidence grows. And the cooking that once felt unfamiliar becomes something you can do almost automatically. Now, if you're a parent watching this, there's a moment in this transition that's easy to recognize. You might visit your child's dorm or first apartment and immediately notice all the ways the space feels inadequate. The stove is small. The cabinets are limited. There's barely room for pots and pans. Your first instinct might be to fix it. Maybe buy better equipment. Maybe add more tools. Maybe recreate the kitchen they had at home. That instinct comes from a good place. For years, part of your role has been making sure the environment worked for them. But this stage of the transition asks something slightly different. Instead of recreating the kitchen they grew up with, the goal becomes helping them adapt to the one they have. Learning how to cook with fewer tools. Figuring out which meals make sense in a smaller space. Building routines that match the life they're stepping into now. Sometimes the most helpful support isn't upgrading the kitchen. It's encouraging the adjustment. Because once that adjustment happens, something important begins to take shape. Confidence. Not the confidence that comes from having the perfect kitchen, but the confidence that comes from realizing you can make things work even when the setup isn't ideal. Cooking for yourself isn't really about mastering recipes. It's about learning how everyday systems shift when responsibility changes. The kitchen may look different. The tools may be fewer. The space may be smaller. The skill you're developing is the same one that applies to many parts of independence. Taking a familiar activity and learning how to make it work in a new environment, and once that shift clicks, cooking stops feeling like a challenge. It simply becomes another part of your routine.